Hey, what's up, everybody? Good morning, and welcome to another TPA Tuesday. I'm psyched that so many of you can join us today, and we don't have to worry about the weather, so you can all enjoy the content without any anxiety about icy roads or anything. In case you don't know me, I'm Ted Ritter, Manager of External Affairs at the NJTPA. And, our TPA Tuesdays, I think, have been, unquestionably one of the most popular components of a public outreach effort that really began last fall to inform the NJTPA's next long-range transportation plan, which we call Plan 2050. Now, on previous TPA Tuesdays, we looked at adapting to change, right? And we also looked at transportation equity. Today, we're talking about realizing opportunity through transportation. We know that, a reliable, connected transportation system not only gets us to all those great places and amenities in our region, but it also allows people to contribute to our economy in a meaningful way. So what we'll do today is spotlight really how transportation drives North Jersey's economy, the importance, right, of strategic transportation investments, not only post-pandemic, but also for the region's economic growth during the course of the next 30 years. So before we get started, let's take care of some minor housekeeping. If you haven't figured out already, we're using Zoom webinar today, right? And you'll notice all the attendees are muted. That's intentional to avoid distractions and any kind of background noises during the presentations. When you have questions for our speakers, what you do is you hit up the chat icon in the menu at the bottom of your screen. Chat box will pop up and you can post your questions there. We're going to do our best on our end to curate everything, get through as many of the questions as we can as time permits. Now let's quickly take a look at this morning's agenda. After our welcome remarks, which we're in the middle of now, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, then go into a moderated panel discussion. Then after that, we'll do the questions. So right now, I would like to introduce the NJTPA's Executive Director, Mary Amin, to get us started. Mary?
Thank you very much, Ted. And good morning, everyone. It's great to have so many of you with us today for our third TPA Tuesday Plan 2050 Symposium entitled Realizing Opportunity Through Transportation. Good transportation is essential for building economic opportunities and for letting people take advantage of those opportunities. We want this to be front and center in people's minds. That's why the subtitle of Plan 2050 is People, Transportation, Opportunity. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has created many challenges, but it also has presented us with some very real opportunities. We've seen a decline in transit ridership with many more people working remotely, but at the same time, we've also seen the system rise to the pandemic's health challenges by safely transporting essential workers to their jobs. We've seen a surge in online retail sales, resulting in increased freight traffic, including many local deliveries, which is creating new challenges to the transportation system. We also watched as some communities took advantage of changes in traffic patterns, transforming space that was traditionally reserved for vehicles into expanded outdoor eating and shopping areas that helped keep local businesses afloat during this difficult time. These challenges and the way that our region is responding to them demonstrate the importance of transportation, not only for getting people around, but also for capitalizing on our region's many opportunities for economic growth, improved social justice, and of course, safe and equitable access to jobs, shopping, recreation, healthcare, and everywhere else we need to go. I'd very much like to thank our speakers. Robert Puentes, the CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, who is giving our keynote, as well as our panelists, Aisha Glover, Vice President of Urban Innovation at Audible, Chris Lutick, Director of Government Affairs at UPS, and William Rodgers, Chief Economist with Rutgers Heldrich Center for Workforce Development. I also want to thank our panel moderator today, Courtney Mercer of Mercer Planning Associates. As Ted indicated, our TPA Tuesdays Symposium series is just one part of the outreach for the long-range transportation plan that we are developing. We also have virtual open house meetings and topic talks coming up later this week and into early February. And you can get details and updates at njtpa.org/Plan 2050. And you can also take and share our brief Plan 2050 survey. We really do value your input and your ideas for Plan 2050, which we expect that the NJTPA board will adopt this coming fall. So thank you again for attending today's TPA Tuesday Symposium. And now I'm going to turn the program back over to Ted Ritter. Thank you.
Mary, thanks a lot for setting the stage for us. Now, I guess without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. We're super fortunate to have with us today. Robert Puentes is president and CEO, as Mary mentioned, of the Center for Transportation, which is a DC-based nonprofit think tank. ENO's mission is improving transportation policy and leadership. Prior to joining the Center, Robert was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Infrastructure Initiative, and he remains a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Before that, Robert was the director of infrastructure programs at the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. He has worked extensively on a variety of transportation issues, including infrastructure, funding and finance, and city and urban planning. He's a frequent speaker to a variety of groups and professional conferences and a regular contributor in newspapers and other media. He's testified before congressional committees too. Robert holds a master's degree from the University of Virginia and was an affiliated professor with Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute. It's my great honor to introduce Robert Puentes.
Thanks very much, Ted. Can everybody hear me okay? Let me go ahead and share my screen. I really want to thank you for the invitation to be here today, especially because I do presentations and speeches and talk to folks all across the country in cities, states, and metropolitan areas. This is particularly dear to me. I'm from New Jersey, born and raised there, born in Secaucus, and you can tell it's true because I called it Secaucus. People pronounce it somewhat differently these days, but I think that's how the locals still like to pronounce it. So it's really great to be talking particularly about transportation these days. As Ted mentioned, we are a Washington-based organization, so we do a lot of work with federal DC. There's obviously an awful lot of attention to federal Washington right now for lots of obvious and important reasons. So there is some optimism. There is some attention that's being placed now on what's going on in the nation's capital. But for the most part, when we talk about transportation and we talk about infrastructure issues broadly, there's so much that's happening in cities, states, and metros all across the country, and so much optimism that things can be better, that things can change, and a lot of the innovation, a lot of the good ideas seem to be coming from elsewhere. So the hope is that the federal Washington can be helpful. But again, I'm really happy to be talking to you all because I think in a lot of ways it's the cities and the metros that are doing a lion's share of the great work these days. But it's also really an exciting and dynamic time in transportation broadly because it is an exciting and dynamic time in our nation's history. So I think despite the frustrations that a lot of people have with infrastructure broadly and this big national narrative that infrastructure is crumbling and that everything is going to we really need this injection of new infrastructure thinking. As I said, there is so much innovation and positive developments in transportation, new partnerships, new policies, new methods of problem solving, and an enormous appetite for places to learn from one another. We are constantly asked for folks to connect us up with other people around the country. They heard something interesting is happening in Kansas City, and tell me about that really interesting project in Chicago, and how do we learn from that failure that they had in another place. And so that's what's really inspiring and wonderful about the things that are going on right now, especially during this time of COVID. We think it is critical for helping people realize opportunity in all of its forms, as Mary and Ted mentioned at the beginning. These are big, kind of amorphous terms, but we think there really is the right frame for infrastructure and transportation today. So let me just start with just a very quick commercial about ENO, who we are. ENO is not an acronym. People think it's an acronym for something. It's actually someone's name. Mr. William Phelps ENO started the foundation in 1921. This is our centenary this year. He was the inventor of the stop sign. He actually designed Columbus Circle up in Manhattan. He was really the world's first traffic engineer. He was trying to figure out how do we sort out all these conflicts that are happening between horseless carriages and trolleys and other things that are happening in the streets of Manhattan. So we drive on the right side of the road thanks to Mr. Eno and all the other things that are attributed to that. So we are now I think we're the only organization in the world, certainly the only one in the country, that's focused on all the modes of transportation. So everything from aviation to electric scooters and everything in between. We work up and down the Federalist chain, as I mentioned, not just in DC, but in cities, states, and metros across the country. And we do it with the public and the private and the nonprofit sectors. We obviously don't do all of that at the same time. We're only about a dozen people full-time working, but we try to focus on issues where we can have the most relevance and impact. We're not an academic institution, even though the work is just as credible as any university. We're trying to focus really on those issues that matter right now. And I don't think there's any question, and I think folks probably will agree with me here, is that transportation and infrastructure has been pushed closer to the front burner of the national policy discourse. Whether or not we get a big infrastructure bill, we can talk about some of those things here in a second, but it certainly has made this a really exciting and dynamic time. So what I want to do is just walk through just a couple of high-level points here. First, I'm going to do just a quick framing for why transportation matters, given this group. I think there's probably some understanding, and Mary mentioned some of that there at the beginning. Then I'll touch on some of the disruptive factors that are affecting the discussion around transportation today, because what I really want to do, especially for this group, which is so transportation fluent, is not frame transportation as the priority issue itself, but really the priority support issue for some of the other major issues that are affecting the country right now. As planners, we always say that transportation is not a means to an end. That transportation is a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. We've all heard that phrase. We've all said it. I've said it, and we always then forget it. And we start talking about transportation things. And that's fine. But if we're just transportation people talking to transportation people about transportation things, we're going to get transportation outcomes, which we have to do. There's lots of reasons to just be talking about transportation. But if we are connecting transportation to these other massive issues that folks are talking about now, that literally everybody on the street is thinking about and concerned about, we've exponentially increased the audience for folks that are thinking and caring about the issues around transportation. Hopefully, we can move some things forward. The third thing then is I'll try to make the case then for what we need for a new path, and what would transportation look like if it was reframed as something that was in support of a bunch of other issues rather than the issue just of itself. So I know that that folks are probably generally familiar, but it's good, I think, just for some scene setting. Transportation matters because it is essential. It is an essential building block of the American economy, as was mentioned at the beginning. Transportation enables global trade, it powers businesses, connects workers to their jobs, creates opportunities for struggling communities, and it provides America an opportunity to be protected from an unpredictable natural environment. And here when we talk about transportation, I'm really talking about the entire transportation ecosystem, from private investments in things like freight railroads, seaports, pipelines, things that are really driven by the private sector themselves, as well as public investments in things like roads, transit, bike ped, airports, traditional transportation investments like that. But transportation is also necessary for the achievement of important national goals. For one, it supports the growth of advanced industries, something that folks in New Jersey know very well. High value manufacturing intensive sectors of the economy that need reliable transportation to connect supply chains and effectively move goods and services across domestic and economic and international borders. Transportation also connects households and across and between metropolitan areas to higher quality opportunities for employment, for healthcare and education. And clean transportation like public transit and bike ped has the potential to reduce greenhouse gases and help achieve resiliency and sustainability goals. So I think we're all generally familiar kind of with the broad frame for why we care about transportation today. But it's important to keep in mind that all this is not happening in a transportation vacuum. As I noted, we're living through a time of really dynamic change in this country. And there are urban historians who look at what's going on now and say, we haven't seen stuff like this in 100 years. Not that we haven't seen individual changes, but a lot of things seem to be happening at the same time. So by almost any measure, this is a really transformative period in American history. And our transportation networks, particularly post-COVID, are impacted by several key priorities, which in turn are also impacted by transportation. So things like race and social equity, climate and resiliency, of course, the priority for economic recovery, the veritable revolution in new technologies, and of course, being from Washington, I have to talk about things like politics and funding and finance, which remain big barriers and impediments to doing a whole lot of things, not just in transportation, but infrastructure broadly. A lot of that is happening in DC, but also in many state capitals. Of course, we know that New Jersey is experiencing some challenges with that as well. So I'll walk through these just kind of quickly and start with race and social equity. As everybody knows, 2020 was a year of profound reckoning here in the United States when it comes to race, and particularly for transportation. And I firmly believe that if we're going to talk about issues around race and equity and social justice, we've got to talk about transportation. Those things are fundamentally connected because transportation is the enabler of all those things we talked about earlier. As we know, many cities are still dealing with the devastating impacts of the interstate highway system that really that plowed through many Black and brown communities all across the country, gutted entire cities, leaving many people profoundly isolated and removed from jobs and other opportunities elsewhere in the region. So we know the focus here is on opportunity, but in a lot of ways, the transportation investments of the past have actually been hindrances to economic opportunity and have actually prevented people from accessing those kinds of opportunities. As I mentioned, transportation is not important for what it is necessarily. It's important for what it does. And one of the most important things that transportation does is connect people up to opportunity. The one key way that it does that, as folks in New Jersey know very well, is by public transit, especially for low-income neighborhoods and households without cars. And in northern New Jersey, we know that Black and Latinx households are far less likely to have access to a car than white households. So transportation and access really needs to be viewed through the lens of race and social equity. This map is from folks at the University of Minnesota, who've mapped out jobs that are accessible by 30 minutes by transit. And you can see, for obvious reasons, if you take the train into Manhattan, you have access to an awful lot of jobs and economic opportunities. All that is concentrated in the urban core. If you put up the same map and looked at access by car, an awful lot of this map is all of a sudden very red. So if you have access to a car, or if you're able to take the train into Manhattan for jobs, your ability to access that kind of opportunity is much greater than if you are relying on public transit, particularly for jobs that may not be situated in the urban core, maybe service jobs or manufacturing jobs or low-skill jobs that may increasingly be more concentrated out on the suburban fringe. So, these accessibility challenges really do get greater, and it's something I want to talk about here in just a minute. Next is our nation's existential challenge with the changing environment. As I think folks are very well familiar, transportation is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases in the United States. About 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from vehicle tailpipes. And so in the same way we talked about race, it's not possible to talk about climate change in the United States and make a dent on climate change if we are not addressing transportation very fundamentally and very directly. And this matters for lots of different reasons. One is that 39% of the US population lives directly on our shorelines. And as we unfortunately know in New Jersey, after Sandy, we've seen the devastation that can happen with the unpredictable natural environment. In response, cities like Boston, cities like Norfolk, Miami are investing billions and billions of dollars to reduce the flooding-related delays that they're experiencing in transportation, and to try to mitigate some of the challenges that we're experiencing with transportation-related climate change. So there's a lot of opportunities as we reinvest in transportation infrastructure, making it more resilient to withstand threats. But the challenge is that a lot of the stuff needs to rebuild right now. We have an awful lot of work to do to make sure that the system is able to withstand these challenges right now. So again, if we're going to deal with climate change, we've got to deal with transportation. A lot of that is around electrification and around fuels, but it's going to have to be around demand reduction as well. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Next thing is the obvious focus on economic recovery and putting Americans back to work, especially post-COVID. These conversations have started back up again as infrastructure as an economic stimulus, and that actually probably is the right thing to do. We know that from some work that we've done in the past that about 11% of the entire U.S. workforce is directly employed in infrastructure. Most of that is transportation. It's hard to parse out, but most of it is in transportation. And that's 11%. That's quite a bit. It's not the person cutting the hair, the person that's filling the potholes. These are direct jobs in infrastructure across the country. But where we miss it a little is that these jobs are mostly in operations. So a few years ago, I'm sure folks remember the term shovel ready. It was the idea about using stimulus in order to put people back to work. Building and fixing infrastructure. Certainly we need to do that, and we still need to do that. But what we've seen is a lot of these jobs are operating the existing system. So think drivers, think bus drivers, think truck drivers. These are pretty good paying jobs for the most part. Some of them are unionized. They come with basic training, low barriers to entry. So they really are good jobs, and probably is the right frame for us to be thinking about infrastructure, especially post-COVID. But to illustrate the difference here, this chart on the right shows, let me move my screen here a little bit, an index showing what's happened to freight in the last few years and what's happened to passenger travel over the last few years. And I think it's pretty obvious when you see what's happened right as soon as COVID hit, the level of passenger movement plummeted. In very real ways. You can see that there. But freight actually didn't plummet as fast. Mary mentioned this at the beginning. A big increase in freight traffic has kind of offset the big drops that we've seen in passenger travel. This is an index that's developed by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics just to measure freight and passenger movement. So again, when we think about economic recovery, when we think about where this country is going, freight is going to be near the top of that list. And then related are the massive technological disruptions that we're experiencing all across the economy, particularly in transportation. Over the last few years, major emphasis on autonomous vehicles. In fact, I would say for the last 3 or 4 years, really hardly been an issue that's been as much attention given to it as the expected onslaught of autonomous vehicles all across the country. And I think folks are familiar that we haven't really seen that kind of massive deployment that some folks predicted would be taking place in 2020, 2021. Some of that may be COVID related, but some of that is that we've shifted a little bit. And the focus is no longer, especially from the private firms, on being the first to market and having the best technology, but because of a bunch of high profile crashes and some fatalities across the country, the focus has really been directly on safety. So the hype around autonomous vehicles has certainly slowed somewhat in the last few years, but we know that there's going to be a whole bunch of pilots that are still getting ready to be rolled out. There's probably some connection with transit. We know that transit agencies are looking at things like low-speed autonomous vehicles that provide shuttle services around fixed routes and kind of dedicated systems. A lot of these pilots are happening around the country. The technology is pretty close to being there, but it is something that we're looking out for this year and in the near future. Clearly an economic impact about what's going to happen with that. But we'll also see unmanned aerial systems, also known as drones, that may be the new hype for 2020, 2021, 2022. There's a lot of indications that COVID may have accelerated the market for these kinds of devices. Some estimates as much as $12 billion over the next year in these kinds of devices. So truly an ability, I think, when it comes to unmanned aerial systems to radically transform how freight is delivered all across the country. Again, some of that is ushered in by COVID, but it's something we definitely need to be looking out for as planners and transportation experts. The last force then I need to mention is around our political and financial challenges. Let me move this bar here so I can see my screen. There we go. Again, obviously, being in Washington, this is a major focus right now. We don't have to get into some of those details. There's a lot of optimism about what's going to happen with the major infrastructure bill and the transportation reauthorization and all that. And certainly the climate and the outlook, I think, is better than it has been in recent years. However, there are still some challenges. I don't want to be naive about what we're up against certainly in the House, but particularly in the Senate. The majorities are really razor thin. It's going to take just a few senators to hold things up. It's less really about Republicans and Democrats as it is around urban and rural. In a lot of cases, that's not new to a lot of people, but it does mean that the path for major legislation is not clear. I do agree with what the incoming secretary said. It's not a question of whether or not it's going to happen, but that it has to happen. This really is something that we do need in this country, but the challenges are still just as great as they were before, maybe a little bit better, but still definitely a challenge politically. And financially, we definitely have some deficits to fill in. This is on the federal level. You can see the numbers here for the highway account of the Federal Transportation Trust Fund and the mass transit account of the same trust fund, both of them running deficits in cash in 2020 fiscal year. A much higher real number when it comes to the highway account than mass transit, but a bigger share of the mass transit account is at risk. So two things to consider here. One is this conversation around a bipartisan infrastructure package, which there may be movement this spring. We'll see what happens there. And then the reauthorization of the surface transportation law, which expires in this September. That may get kicked out. We may have a longer conversation, but I think we need to look at some of these things together, because when we think about what I'm going to get to next about this path forward, a lot of the things that this administration in particular have been talking about may manifest themselves in either one of those bills. So let's see. Here we go. The last thing that I want to end on is that what all this then means post-COVID. I do think the way that we deliver, finance, design, and govern transportation is changing. And that's not surprising, as I said, because the country is changing and changing fundamentally, right? So here I'm reminded by a quote from my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, who said, if we keep doing things the way you always did, we'll always get what we always got. I think I got that right. If we always do what we always did, we'll always get what we always got. And we can't do that, obviously, in transportation anymore because things are so different. We don't know what things are going to look like when we emerge from COVID, but we do know that transportation is going to look different. And so we're going to have to do things differently when it comes to transportation. So I'll leave you with just a couple of things. One is I think the nation really does need a strong and reliable federal partner. This is not necessarily because of what's happened with the new administration, but we definitely need Washington to be present where heretofore they have been conspicuously absent in a lot of ways. They need to lead in certain areas where only the federal government can lead. This is not because of $2 trillion investments or anything like that, but the size and scope and scale of certain issues, things like freight, and aviation, and setting out regulatory issues around autonomous vehicles. These things need a national partner to be front and center when it comes to who is in charge of that. We don't want 50 states regulating autonomous vehicles, for example. And as we know, there's going to be a big focus on climate with this new administration. We've seen that from the new appointees. We've seen it from their testimony for their confirmation hearings. Climate is going to be a major issue that cities and states have taken the lead on in recent years. Certainly in the Northeast Corridor with the climate initiatives that are happening and the agreements between states. But it is an area where we think the federal government does need to lead and be very, very present. So there's a bunch of things where we think the federal government's got to really step out. But in a lot of other ways, they also need to step aside and empower places to do different things and to let innovation happening. Because, as I said, we're going to come out of this pandemic with new ideas and new interest from places that are going to require a bunch of testing and pilots and new ideas. And we're going to have to be a little more forgiving about places and let them try out things, let them fail. As I said at the beginning, let them learn from one another. There's an insatiable demand for that right now across the United States. So a couple of good examples. I know the congestion pricing in New York is a controversial issue in New Jersey, but it's a great example of where we had the city that wanted to do this being held up for unclear reasons by the federal government. But that is a great example, irrespective of its merits. I know we can get into that, but of an area where the federal government should let things like that happen, learn from it, and then we can scale up and expand those issues, those pilots around the country. Flexible funding, allowing places to spend money with how they see fit. Obviously, the transportation needs in New Jersey are very different than they are in a place like Montana. States should really be given the ability and encouraged to use the ability that they have right now to flex funds for the investments that they need. And then we need to maximize the investments that we have, right? We talk about big issues, trillions of dollars of infrastructure funding that are coming, but we've got to make sure that we're getting the best bang for the buck right now. There's lots of different ways that we are measuring performance and measuring outcomes and all this stuff now, but all kinds of data need to be generated, best practices, shared learning, all that stuff needs to be part of a robust federal program. Then I think we need to change the way that we think about transportation and its very purpose. And for years, we know we focused on transportation as alleviating traffic, right? For lots of reasons we don't really have to get into. But the concern was, how fast can we move vehicles on roadways? And when there are problems, let's figure out ways to deal with that, which mostly resulted in expanding road capacity and limiting access to certain roads in order to make vehicles flow faster. That did not solve the problem. That only made the issue worse in many places, compounded needs for rehabilitation, maintenance, and all the things that we know about. So the latest thing that we've seen, or not the latest, but then we started to focus a little bit more on issues around mobility and recognizing not just on vehicles, but all kinds of movement. Still traditional measures in a lot of cases, things like level of service and travel times, again, for obvious reasons. But those solutions still, new capacity, new transit investments, new partnerships, new ways of doing business, all across the board. So mobility certainly worked for some time, but a better approach, I think, now is nesting mobility in this larger frame of access and accessibility, which I think in a lot of ways is synonymous to the frame around opportunity that we've presented here on in this session. Access is concerned with travel times and costs to reach certain destinations, but the actions include things like land use and new partners that are outside of transportation. So focusing less on just moving vehicles around and moving people around, and focusing more on what happens when people actually get to their destinations. It's not just enough to have people be able to have a seamless trip from one place to another, but it has to be a place where they actually can, where something positive happens. And that's where this whole issue of opportunity comes in. This is not easy because it requires changing transportation planning and practice in a lot of very fundamental ways, but I do think it's someplace where we need to go. There's some examples internationally and some good examples that are happening here in the United States. So the last thing then is, it seems clear that transit will also need to change a bit post-COVID. I'm not trying to be a doomsayer here. We've certainly transit advocates. We certainly need more and high functioning transit all across the country. But this is a challenge. We have to be realistic about the challenges that transit is facing right now, especially emerging from the pandemic. There's certainly been some federal help, which has provided really a lifeline for transit agencies across the country, enable them to prevent the major cuts, the major workforce layoffs that they've talked about. But we're going to have to figure out ways to think a little bit differently about transit post COVID. Again, for the same reason, we just can't keep doing things the same way. We've got to engage in new partnerships so that we're not just transit people talking to transit people, but that we're talking to civic institutions and folks who are focused on things like housing and education and healthcare, and making sure that the transit that we're providing is actually getting people where they want to go and maximizing the opportunity that they have when they get there. Transit agencies, as I said, need to work with one another to learn best practices. There's a lot of similar challenges that are happening across the country. Runs a multi-agency exchange program we call MAX, which is doing just that, connecting up agencies so that they can learn from one another and share best practices, and working with the private sector. And I don't just mean on transactions, PPPs or something like that, but new ways that that public agencies and private companies can work together to think about transit, whether that's new mobility provisions, whether it's transit-oriented development. All these things are not new, but we've got to make them much more routine and much more part of the lexicon about how transit functions and operates. We also then probably need, unfortunately, to do more with less. As I said, there is some money coming in, but transit is going to be experiencing some challenges over the next few years. I don't think that working from home is going to take over everything. Like a lot of folks have kind of foretold that central cities are going to be declining because everybody's going to be working from home and no one's going to be taking transit anymore. I certainly do not think that is the case at all. We're still going to need cities for the same reason we've always needed cities, and transit has a major role to play in that. But if you think about somebody working from home maybe once every 2 weeks, right, that's a 10% drop. And if you were a transit user, that's a 10% drop. And these are just going to be tougher for transit agencies to absorb in the future. So we've got to focus on things like true asset management plans. We've got to focus on savings on the existing system and making sure what we have on the ground right now is functioning at its maximum that it possibly can. And related is the final thing is to focus then on people. It sounds obvious. But redesigning things like bus routes and making sure that transit is getting people to where they want to go, that we use sensible fares, that we have improved transit stops, that transit has become, it remains and becomes something that is a preferred option for people, particularly post-COVID, is going to be critical in order for the country to recover. Because if we're going to have national economic recovery, we're going to need cities, and cities are going to need transit. It's a very clear path all the way around. So let me then just end where I began. As I said, it's an interesting and dynamic time in transportation, and its role in providing access and opportunity has really never been clearer. There's tons of innovation. There's tons of new ideas that are out there. Hopefully a lot of that is going to come from federal Washington, but I really do think that most of that is going to come from people like you who are on the Zoom call here today, people who understand that transportation is a means to an end and not the end in itself. I want to thank you all for having me here today. Thank you, Mary, Ted, and Courtney, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. If you could just stop your screen share, and then all of our panelists, if you could turn on your video so we can see everybody in Brady Bunch view. Great. Thank you. So yes, Robert, thank you for your engaging and informative talk. And thanks again for staying on for the panel discussion. Now we'd like to give each of our three panelists an opportunity to provide reactions and responses to what you've just said in context of their own experiences. Aisha, can you lead off?
Sure. Thank you again for having me. I'm definitely excited to participate in the discussion. I was fascinated. First of all, I was reading the chat, of course, so fascinated to really think about that from the Newark perspective. I'm a native New Yorker. Mobility is kind of bred into me, but for Newark, really thinking about your discussion, and I'm simultaneously reading Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And so some of your comments as it relates to the highways and access and equity. I visually seen that growing up and have been affected by it, and see how that plays out in Newark as well. Another thing that stood out for me is oftentimes we think of transportation, or at least as I do as a non-transit person, non-urban planner, as really wanting to get from point A to point B because I have work, I have something to do. And so your comments just around what that experience looks like and feels like also resonates. So it's not just the means to that end, but what does that experience look like? And so thinking about the pedestrian access, walkability, safety, thinking about what that looks like when individuals are honestly just trying to get their children to school, or they're trying to get to church or shopping, right? So it's not just, I think for so many reasons and for so long, we've thought about infrastructure and transit as really workforce related, getting people to work. I know a few years ago, Brooklyn was exploring the Brooklyn Queens connector. I forgot exactly the name. And it was really to address that north-south travel, because for years, the entire transit system was oriented around, excuse me, east-west, right? So getting people from Queens and Brooklyn to Manhattan for work. And so as job hubs expanded in the boroughs, the need for so much more of that north-south travel just became that much more obvious. So I just wanted to add that color, because it just becomes so much more abundantly clear that transit is not just for getting to work or X activities. We really have to think about what that experience looks and feels like. I've seen the comments in the chat about biking, and really be thinking about the active transportation side as well, because that's what creates communities. And because of the build out of infrastructure, intentionally trying to dismantle communities, right? And the systemic racism around that, I think being very thoughtful and deliberate and intentional about how transportation, transit access and infrastructure how do we now shift that to rebuild and think about communities and think about neighborhoods that, quite frankly, were either destroyed or were really the backbone for just getting to a job. So I know I just said a lot, but you sparked so many different things with Color of Law and looking around in Newark and seeing the impact of 78, seeing the impact of 280, and then growing up in Brooklyn and knowing how intentional the construction of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway was, and the division that caused. So lots of thoughts, and looking forward to our discussion. And I hope that made sense.
It absolutely did. Thank you, Aisha. And I do, it's a little foretelling, because that will be our first question. I'm looking forward to digging into that concept a little more after we do these intros. I'd like to bounce to Chris, please. You're still.
Yep, there we go. Yeah, thank you, Robert. Yeah, and I'll tell you what, it's for me, being a part of working at UPS, and I just think about infrastructure, and we just talk about just our footprint and what we try to do every day with delivering with e-commerce. Then you also take the transit part of it, of how we're generally always one of the top employers in every state across the country, and obviously in New York and New Jersey, having a very dependable, reliable transportation network to get people back and forth. So, you look at all these avenues, you look at buses and you look at trains. We talked about bikes. We have the planes landing at the local airports in Newark and JFK. And so we just kind of always look at all these things that take place, and the importance of the infrastructure, the congestion part of it, the sustainability part of it, which is a big issue. So there's so many things that touch and how we can do this. And, we pride ourselves on the fact that, we have a very consolidated network of delivery, which is very impactful, but yet congestion in the urban cities is an issue, right? We look at, bikes, we're looking at, and one thing I'll talk about later on is, how other ways for us to move freight back and forth between New York and New Jersey to reduce congestion. So there's a lot of things that you touched on here that are just very impactful to us as a company who, as we all know, we're very familiar with us in delivering with, especially with COVID and the boom of e-commerce and everything. So it's just very impactful, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Bill, you're next.
Sure. Good morning, and good morning, and thank you, Robert. Thank you for your outstanding presentation. I want to, I guess, react to respond to some of the disruptive factors that you discussed, and then finished with just some comments on your some of the things that you talked about in your path forward. With regards to the disruptive factors, I was really appreciative that you talked about race and social policy or social equity right up front, and you jogged some of my thoughts in some areas with a project that I'm working on with some folks at the RAND Corporation, their research group, where they've led by Catherine Edwards, one of our other colleagues. They've embarked upon a conversation around how to model reparations and damages. What they've done thus far is they're sort of pushing or keeping the reparations conversation to slavery. But where it connects to what you're talking about is they're also going starting from the end of slavery and looking at federal policy going forward to the present and identifying policies that were either structurally racist overtly, or they weren't necessarily targeted as race specific or ethnic specific or even gender specific, but they had a disparate impact because a larger share of, in this case, African Americans or Blacks, were affected. And one of their hopes is to then generate, at least tell the narrative. Here, remind us, here is how, and this isn't trying to make white people feel guilty. This is just helping people understand how public policy, created these disadvantages, and then show how they had their cumulative causal adverse effects going forward. And so, you're mentioning of the interstate highway system, that presumably it's not a racially overt policy. I'm a labor economist, and so I'm sort of stepping out of my comfort zone a little bit, which is always a good thing. But I think you're talking about that, and so one aspect of a project that you all might consider is something similar to RAND, and really help people understand how transportation policy really disadvantage these groups, and then have these cumulative causal effects that Bob Margo likes to talk about. And then the other thing that just jumped out at me too, and what you were sharing, you didn't use the phrase, but it sounds like spatial mismatch is still alive and well. And for those in the audience who are not familiar with that concept, but it's this notion that African Americans in particular might have difficulty moving to suburban areas because they can't afford the cost of living, where there's still housing segregation, combined with that employers are tending to build in the suburbs or build in places where people of color don't have access to cars, as you mentioned. And it reminded me of a project that I did with some Blaustein School students a number of years ago, where we were studying opportunities at the ports and opportunities at the port. But we found was, if you, at that time, this is probably close to 10 years ago, if you were coming from certain parts of Newark, which again happened to be largely Black, you had to get to the train station by 6 or 6:30 in the morning, because that was the one New Jersey Transit link to take you out to the port. And so, from what I understand, subsequently that's been addressed, but that's a major issue, and it still continues to be a problem. And I liked your comments about the climate and resiliency, and it made me think about limits to growth. right? And that if we continue doing the same thing as we're doing, we're going to, the congestion, the environmental problems, or the degradation on the environment, we're going to max out in terms of our ability to expand economic growth. And this is the reason why we need innovation, the kinds of things that you talked about to help provide that. And that leads me to that next, my other comment, right, is that your conversation made me also think about Joseph Schumpeter. He's an economic historian who, talks about coined this phrase called creative destruction. And that is that, when there's one industry that looks like it's contracting, there are other industries that are expanding. And so the notion that, that we're going to see more automation in the transportation industry. Now, yes, there will be some jobs that are going to go by the wayside, but you're going to have a productivity effect that's going to generate demand or generate and create other types or new types of opportunities or jobs. And then finally, on the path forward, some of the things you talked about. I do a lot of work in thinking about what the United Nations calls human priorities or investments in human priorities. And some of my work seems to find we've been slowing down, or we've slowed down in our investments in human priorities. Deferred maintenance, right? And I get the sense that I could take transportation investment and swap it right in, or physical investments, and swap out human priority investments and put that in, and say that we've also had this problem that there's been deferred maintenance, right? And the overarching problem it's going to have is it's going to put a limit on labor productivity growth. Right, it's going to put a limit on population growth, which those are the two main ingredients in a real highbrow sense to economic growth, right? And so what you're getting at really is it's, yes, all economics is local in a lot of ways, and all politics is local, but all of this adds up and aggregates up to competitiveness, to economic growth as a nation. And then the last comment on your path forward. This is now, for me, I'm pulling together some conversations that I've been having recently with some folks who do work in the return to the office space. And one of my colleagues here, he takes what Dr. Fauci and other public health officials are saying, is that, yes, we're in this pandemic right now and we're going to get through it, but there will be other pandemics. And unfortunately, and that's what the public health officials are suggesting, and they're already saying, connect the dots. Right? You had Ebola, you had SARS, and it was just, the pattern continues. And so, what this one colleague suggests is, we as a nation need to probably come up with something analogous to the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, but in the context of, in this case, transportation. Right? What are, for help as a federal, could it be a federal conversation, right? Help state, local communities or regional communities figure out, okay, as we redesign transportation, or as we do new investments, right? We probably now have to take into account the fact that we need that the density matters. Because we are going to see other types of viruses that are going to unfortunately hit us or plague us. So let me stop there. As Aisha said, a lot of great content to respond to. So hope it was helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And we do have a couple more minutes in this segment. I don't know if Robert, you want to any kind of response to the response, or we can move on to the next topic.
Just very quickly, thank you very much for the remarks and for the comments. And I really wrote down that last piece about ADA for transportation. That sounds like a great idea. I would love to talk to you about that. I think it was just gratifying to hear the remarks and the way that you framed them, because it's kind of what I was trying to do. It seems weird for somebody who's been in transportation most of his professional career and works for a transportation organization to be trying to deflect the conversation away from transportation. But that's kind of what I was trying to do here. And it was very gratifying to hear Aisha, Chris, and Bill talk about that in their own context. Aisha about workforce, and Chris around the economy, and Bill around social equity and health and other issues. So that's kind of what I was trying to do. So I really appreciate the way that you framed your remarks around what it means for you. And that's what I'm trying to to do, especially here post-COVID, is make sure that transportation is nested under those big issues. Because, I mean, to hear about the passion that the three of you talked about your own issues and transportation's role in that, I think we really get as far as a nation. So thank you for your remarks.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, and I maybe should have prefaced this as that I don't know if anybody who's watching notices that this panel is not full of transportation folks as past panels have been, and that was very intentional so that we can start to nest transportation into other concepts. So moving on, we know that good transportation system is a major leading indicator of a place's economic success. Let's discuss how New Jersey's robust multimodal network has helped spur revitalization and new economic opportunity. How has it impacted development, redevelopment of housing, office, retail, manufacturing? But in this frame of mind, let's also talk a bit about how the rising tide has not necessarily lifted all boats, and what inequitable access to transportation means to housing and employment options for those of lesser means. Aisha, could you kick this one off?
Sure. Lots to hit on here. I previously led economic development under Newark's Mayor Rajay Baraka for several years before I kind of made the transition over to Audible in this new Global Center for Urban Development. But under the mayor's leadership and alongside the city's Economic Development Corporation, we were obviously hyper focused on our downtown core. There was a 5-ward strategy and very targeted neighborhood revitalization efforts. But one thing I always used to say or joke in private, and now I'm kind of saying more publicly, is Newark's downtown is just not there yet, right? And so I think the thinking that the downtown is fine, let's focus on our neighborhoods, we were really trying to purposely and intentionally think about the strategy, a comprehensive strategy that both acknowledged that the downtown core wasn't where it needed to be, as well as be very deliberate about investments and development into the neighborhoods. But I say that to say we have this I like to believe, and I've asked some consultants to look into this, probably one of the largest transit hubs in the nation when you take into account the highways, the rail, the port, and the major international airport. And so we really kind of zeroed in on transit-oriented development in the downtown core. You saw openings of new parks and tens of millions of dollars of investment into public parks, Riverside Park, Mulberry Commons, Ironside building, which was a passively used warehouse for many years, reopened about 2 years ago after a full renovation, attracting Mars Wrigley as as the hub of its new headquarters. But again, still a lot of room for growth and opportunity. So when I think about urban revitalization, I think of 3 things: people, policy, and programs. And so on the people side, that has to relate to existing and potential residents. And we talked about the workforce. We can't just build to think about who else we want to come in. We have to think about existing residents and mobility. Around policy, I actually think it's also really important for us to think about corporate policy. And so I've been so steep in public policy over the last several years, first under Bloomberg, then de Blasio, and then Baraka, but now at Audible, really trying to think of our own economic and community impact measures that tie right back to local procurement, local hiring, right? So on the policy side, and I know I raised earlier that I'm rereading, or I should say listening to, since I read it before, now I'm listening to Color of Law. I think there's some acknowledgement and recognition that has to occur for how steep public policy impacted racial and still continues to impact racial equity and access, right? And so I think being very thoughtful and deliberate about policies that are curative is really important. Then the last piece, around programs, because so many of these issues of access that are related to revitalization, to Courtney, as you pointed out, that rising tide does not always lift all boats, because the issues are so steep, and we do need policy to correct. I do think that there is room for programs. So programs feel transactional, they feel one-off, right? But I think that it allows us to pilot, to have proof of concept, to get some of that consensus building that's really necessary in order to ultimately advance policy. So maybe I switched the order. Maybe program should have came first and then policy. But I think as we think about urban revitalization and people are at the core, we're solving for some ultimate policy changes, but these programs can be a really effective way of demonstrating proof of concept. So maybe I'll just pause there before I kind of.
Great. Thank you, Aisha. And I think Newark is, a great example of a bunch of the things that you were talking about. Audible One, with your commitment as a anchor institution to the revitalization and to the local businesses. If anyone doesn't know, Audible has this great, I forget what it's called exactly, the Lunch Out program, where basically they give vouchers to their employees to leave the building and buy food from the small businesses downtown, which is actually fabulous. But we're also seeing, while Newark is considered revitalized and it is a great business hub, a lot of those businesses are hurting right now because there's not enough of a mix of residential downtown now that the pandemic's there, and Prudential's empty and the other office buildings are empty, and so those same small businesses are really hurting because that land use mix isn't taking full advantage of the transportation network there. Bill, you want to chime in a little bit on this one?
Sure, and I'll offer my comments or thoughts from the perspective of a labor economist and labor policy analyst. Because one thought, and this was done with some work with the Institute for Social Justice a number of years ago, but I still maintain that it's a very important approach, and that is. And it touches on a bit of what Aisha was getting at towards the end of her remarks, and that is the private sector, especially your larger companies, really need to take on the breadth of becoming advocates for community success, take on the role of being community champions, right? And what I mean by an advocate for success or a community champion is, yes, I understood to still be about making money, but to do it in a way where you're investing in the people of the community, right? As opposed to the physical plants. Let's build a stadium. Let's build an arena. Let's build a factory or an office space. That leads to gentrification, right? But invest in the human capital and the social capital in those communities, and just as you mentioned, Courtney, right? That those individuals who more than will live there and work in that community and spend their money, right, in that community, and so you get the sort of the ripple effect, you get that multiplier effect, and so in as much as we can see more companies. And particularly because of the pandemic, I think many private sector companies will have that potentially that more economic motive to become community champions. And some of the things another project I'm working with some people, we're in the process of thinking about developing a kind of a report card framework where we award, use a lead type of system where you award or acknowledge companies that are a platinum level because they are meeting a certain set of community champion type of activities, such as investing in the communities, investing in the social capital of the community, and really paying it forward. So that's what one thought on that. The other big picture thought that's a concern, and transportation fits into it, And that is, many of our viewers or listeners may have heard of a concept called ALICE, where ALICE stands for, it's an acronym that stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained and Employed. It's a concept that was developed by the United Way of Northern New Jersey a number of years ago. And it basically captures, now we've gone nationally, but it captures for New Jersey, the share of our households that are living at or below what the cost of living, what they need to survive or to survive in their community. And to date, in about New Jersey, about 39% of our households are at or below this ALICE threshold. And you talked about rising tide doesn't lift all boats. If you watch ALICE since 2010, this is a perfect example where our ALICE population, our ALICE households in New Jersey actually grew during this best economy since World War II. Grew for three main reasons: rising childcare costs, rising healthcare costs, and then also stagnating wages. So where does transportation fit into that? It fits into the sense of if we have better, stronger transportation networks, more efficient, right? That can actually allow people to move to either move or to commute to those jobs that offer higher wages and better benefits. And that it also provides more time. If it's more efficient, it provides more time to be able to do those things with investing in your family, investing in your children and your community. So Alice is, even though her transportation budget line has not been increasing that much, but you have these other pieces that, again, where I like Robert's use of the word tissue, that transportation is the tissue that binds communities together. And as we move forward, if we can really strengthen that tissue, that will also can help Alice out with regards to, as I said, wages, getting to housing opportunities, being able to commute more effectively, and to be able to spend more time with their family.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I think that's a key point, and we've heard it a lot over the last, since we started. We hear it a lot even before we started Plan 2050. But that disconnect between workers and the workplace, and there's a great example outside this region, in Mercer County, where a lot of the people who work in the warehouses, the Amazon warehouses, in Hamilton, live in Trenton, but there's not the bus will take them to Hamilton Square on 130, but won't get them to the actual warehouses that they're working at, which then, people are late and end up losing those jobs. And it costs everybody, right? It costs the business to hire new people. Actually, go ahead, Aisha. Yeah.
As Bill was talking, it was just making me think of, his comments related to investing in human and social capital. I think as corporations and institutions and employers, we have really an obligation to be thinking about our economic footprints. And, given the current climate that we're in right now, in many respects, downtown Newark has had a triple whammy, right? So 2 of our major venues are closed, NJPAC and Prudential Center, and the entire corporate base is gone. Right. And so you brought up the Lunch Out Wednesday program earlier, where we were literally giving out debit cards to our staff to force them out of our buildings, because we all know what happens when you're in a corporate building all day and you have all the bells and whistles, why leave, right? And that's part of the psychology of place. But we pivoted that program during COVID because we know that the impact of our presence or our absence and our peers' absence could very well be detrimental to the city, and already has in many respects, right? And so we pivoted that program into Newark Working Kitchens, and essentially have been paying restaurants to stay open, prepaying meals, and then those meals get connected to the food insecure and people who need it the most around the city. Is it self-serving? Maybe a bit, because we want to make sure that when we return, there is a thriving downtown and these businesses are still open, but we've retained dozens and dozens of restaurants. Literally, some have told us, but not for this program, they would have been closed. That has helped retain over 200 jobs, and we've been providing meals every single week since the first week of April. We just surpassed 700,000 meals, and Audible itself has kicked in $4 million. So I think we're definitely at a place, and we're past the place where, as corporations and anchor institutions, we have to recognize our role and impact on some of these major retail corridors and how that's impacting small businesses and jobs and the rest of the city. They're all locally owned and operated businesses, and most of them employ at least between 70 and 80% of their workforce are local residents, right? And so it's really coming full circle. I just wanted to share that as an example of what companies can do to really continue to think about what various ways of them investing in the communities in which they're based and investing in human and social capital.
Yeah. So if I could jump in, it's a quick question, follow-up question. How did you all get to that place, or what was the mechanism? Was it from the CEO? Basically said, we are going to be a community champion on this piece. What?
Yeah. So two ways. The program that Courtney mentioned, Lunch Out Wednesdays, I think was really the precursor to Newark Working Kitchens. And we subsidized something like 40,000 meals pre-COVID. And it was a way to get our workers out and patronizing local businesses, because Audible and many corporations are already paying for their staff to eat, right? And so I think it is a mind shift to think about, if you already have a food budget, rather than this major corporate food service provider, how can you think beyond philanthropy, right? Because oftentimes these issues get pegged under the corporate social responsibility or foundation arm, which Audible actually purposefully doesn't have either. Right? How do you think about economic solutions that are not strictly charitable? And so that was some of the thinking around the Lunch Out Wednesdays, and there's actually similar programs like that. So we shift that new model. Yes, Don Katz, the founder and chairman, is very much always thinking about ideas like this. And quite frankly, it's ingrained in the culture. We literally have to sign a pledge when you get your offer letter. We want this type of thinking and innovation and creativity in our workforce. So it's not only focused on the service that we provide.
Yeah, that was you. Yeah, you got to the point where I was. What was the aha moment, or what was? So it sounds like there's a embedded culture.
Absolutely,
it's embedded in the culture of your organization.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to the next segment. Along with the rise of e-commerce and the gig economy of goods and people movement, competition for our transportation infrastructure is increasing. This was already a significant trend before the pandemic, but has certainly accelerated the pace. What do we need to be thinking about in terms of infrastructure improvements to keep up with demand? And how does technology play into this discussion? Chris, could you lead us off on this one?
Sure. Thanks, Courtney. And as you can imagine, thinking about our network and how many employees and drivers we have here just in the New York and New Jersey area alone in the highways. One thing is I can tell you on an annual base, if our drivers are delayed 5 minutes, that costs UPS about $114 million annually. So we're always thinking about, what are the ways? What are the issues with infrastructure? And it really comes down to, we look at the congestion, we look at the bridges and the tolls and the highways. And a lot of it also comes down to the ability for us is to be able to park, to be able to have a place where we can station our vehicles, be able to just sit once, make those deliveries in the urban areas and in the areas in the cities, whether it's Newark, New York City, major Camden areas, anything like that. So, we look at that. And then, the big thing, is the delays and the structures. We look at the tolls and the conditions of the highways and everything that goes on around us, the port area. We have the airport, we have the port, we're really kind of, as I always say, I feel like we're in the center of the universe, given the location we are. When you think about the number of the population and the size and the commerce of it. So, and you look at this and now you say, yes, it was all these deliveries, and this e-commerce was growing before the pandemic, and it really went to another level because now you pulled in another group of people who really probably weren't embracing using their app. They weren't used to using Uber, and they weren't using Uber Eats and all this. And you see this on the road, right? You go into the cities now. How many more cars? It's funny. Congestion has kind of gone away because of COVID, but in reality, there's a lot more cars that would never existed before outside of the yellow cabs when you're in these urban areas because of this. And so, we always look at it from a infrastructure standpoint. Is you can't make roads any more bigger than what they are in some cases, right? But it's the dependability, the conditions of the roads. And for us, the infrastructure really is about having dedicated areas to be able to allow businesses such as ours, all of us who are dedicated carriers who are providing a lot of commerce for businesses and for people in these urban areas. And that's the ability to say, have designated areas, whether it's a green zone for a vehicle that might have zero emission, anything like that, to kind of help offset those things and to be dedicated. The other thing too is, from a technology standpoint is, we really look at, you go and you deliver and people aren't available. And now you give people an option to say, okay, I can go to a local access point to pick up my package to do. So I get it, I'm supposed to get it in 1 or 2 days. I got it in 1 or 2 days. I wasn't available, but it was able to go. Now I'm able to walk down the street and go to a local vendor, local store, and whoever it may be, to pick up those packages to kind of keep those things going. And that's a part of the whole, how it ties into technology and infrastructure, is really having the space allocation to be able to go and deliver and provide the commerce in the communities that we're in. That's really the challenge that we have. And that anyone will have, the Amazons, FedEx, anybody who's trying to provide commerce to people, because those numbers are going to continue to grow. It's really become second nature for us. The technology piece of it, it's on our phones. It's easy as ABC, and we do everything basically from our phones. And as it becomes, as I say, people are shopping at midnight and they place an order, because if you order before 12 o'clock, you get an extra 20% off, and you'll have the order the next day. And those things are things that are coming in, and that's increasing the demand on the network and the infrastructure, and having more and more people on the roads making deliveries, because we're not the only ones who are making deliveries. People are delivering out of their cars, they're delivering out of vans. I'm going to date myself, station wagons. We don't see too many of those, but there's people out there that are doing those things, and it's creating a lot more congestion. And the roads aren't going to get any bigger, but I think the key is really to have designated areas for companies like us to be able to go and provide the services to the community, and also reduce the friction and the tension and the traffic and all the congestion that goes on in the city, in the urban development areas.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and it's amazing to see how many different people are delivering. That my Blue Apron comes in a unmarked van. It's not coming from UPS. It's not coming, and I could see she's got Blue Apron, HelloFresh, and every other. So she's a contract worker, gig worker, taking care of that. So it's a lot of vehicles on our local roads nowadays. Robert, you want to chime in here on commerce and freight and all?
Sure, thank you. I do that as some overlap with what Chris, obviously, as an expert in all this, has mentioned, and I do think there is a lot that we can do with technology, and especially when you look across, in other countries, there's a whole lot more that we can do here in the United States. All this around intelligent transportation system, which is basically just using telecommunications and other digital technology to improve the transportation system. We're woefully outdated and outmoded here in this country. There's so much that we can do to squeeze as much as we can out of the existing system. As Chris said, we're not making roads any bigger in most cases. So we've got to do better with what we have. Clearing incidents very quickly, managing traffic remotely. There are a lot of different things that we know how to do, but for whatever reason, we just have not done a really good job deploying that here in the United States. It's a lot easier, the proverbial, you can cut a ribbon in front of a new thing. It's not so easy to do that in front of new digital technology. It doesn't have the same political gravitas, I guess. So we definitely need to do much more with technology to make goods flow quicker and smoother by clearing incidents and managing traffic. And his point also around making the space for that. We have seen this big increase in e-commerce and smaller trucks and smaller deliveries, especially in cities, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And I know there's been a lot of comments in the chat around things like bike and ped and those conflicts. We've got to figure out ways to share that precious space better. We're not building, especially in major urban areas and in dense urban cities. We've got to figure out better ways to resolve those conflicts between parking and bikes and e-commerce deliveries. There's a couple of cities that are starting to lead in this, and I really think that once a couple of cities start to crack that code, we're going to see that replicate across the country. It's going to be something, but we need to do a better job at figuring all that out. I mentioned unmanned aerial systems and drones. This is something that we've been doing a lot of work on. You don't want to be just diving feet first into every technology, especially what we've seen about autonomous vehicles. But we do think that UAS is going to have some big impact. And UPS, I know for one, is investing a lot, and this has a lot of other companies. So paying attention to see what that does for e-commerce and freight delivery over the next few years. And the last thing I think is around workforce. We kind of touched on this in the previous conversation, but a lot of these distribution centers are massive job centers, and there's a great unfortunate example in Baltimore where some big company, which will remain nameless, built a giant distribution center in a part of Baltimore. And then the state was cutting transit service because they had budget cuts, which was the only way for a lot of workers to get to that facility. So back to my point to the presentation about new kinds of partnerships, new kinds of working together. We've got to see a lot of these big employers having a much bigger role in some of these decisions, especially around transit and job access, because if somebody didn't step in there in the last minute, those workers would have had no way to get to that major employment center.
Great, thanks, Robert. And I'm
I just add one thing on technology. At UPS, we have a program what we call Orion, and what it does is it takes in all the data analytics of all the deliveries, and it actually maps out the route of the day. And we've been delivering packages for over 100 years, and you get into this thing where you think, okay, we've been delivering this route for 25 years, and we know you're going to go out, you're going to have this, and you should go 22 miles. And we've been doing it for 25 years. Well, we implemented this new technology about 7 years ago that actually takes in all the data elements that are in there. And now we're saying, well, you can actually do that in 19 miles and shave off 3 miles and shave off 5 miles. Could be 8 miles, could be 2 miles. But when you take the numbers of how many vehicles we have on the road across the country and around the world, you start adding up those miles. And that's where technology outside of an app on a phone has really come into play for us and help added additional, anytime you can reduce miles, right? That helps the infrastructure, that helps congestion, it helps everything, sustainability. So there's a lot of benefits to that, obviously. So, that's one of the things that, where technology has also come into play outside of, the classic app and Google Maps and everything that we have on our phones.
Right. Thanks, Chris. I am keeping an eye on the chat, and I did see a follow-up question to Robert about the incident management. And we seem to have that on state highways, but a lot of these deliveries are happening on local streets. They're wondering if you could suggest ways for municipalities and counties, the locals, to be able to address that. And I don't know if you know that New Jersey, well, you do know, we have 565 individual municipal units here that don't necessarily talk to each other all the time. So it's complicated by that.
Yeah, and I don't know to the extent that the state does or does not give money to the municipalities for transportation investments. In a lot of other states, they do. In a lot of municipalities, choose to spend that on other types of infrastructure. And again, some of that's necessary, obviously new roads and maintenance and upkeep and all that. It's just a broader comment about the lack of attention that we give to incident management, to other kinds of digitization of the transportation system. When we think about upgrades to existing infrastructure, we think so much about asphalt and steel and stuff like that, which we need for obvious reasons. We've got to think more about digital tech, whether that money comes from states. Again, every state is different in how they do that. This is also a place where you can see the federal government having a major impact. You can see a federal program that's starting to give this out, and it's not that that much relatively inexpensive, right? Especially compared to a mile of roadway or reconstructing a lot of infrastructure. The digital tech can have a profound effect and get a much bigger bang for the buck if done correctly.
Great, thanks. Aisha or Bill, do you have anything to add to this one, or shall I move on to workforce?
Proceed.
Proceed. Okay, got it. Great. So taking into consideration all that we've already discussed about revitalization and commerce, what workforce opportunities does New Jersey's transportation network spur? Does it impact how we should be training and or reskilling our workforce? And how does automation impact these workforce opportunities now and in the future? And if I can, I'd like to toss it to you first, Bill, since you are with the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development and all.
Yeah, my work, or the current work, has really been focusing on automation, and automation beyond just transportation. And so I can I'll speak to that that issue, and then I'll talk a little bit about some work that a colleague, friend of mine, David Weil, from Brandeis, he's been doing work on what we call fissured workplaces, and I believe that is in transportation is an industry that he cites as having what he calls fissured workplaces, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But with regards to automation, I mean, some of the there are an increasing number of studies that seem to that suggest that there are. Well, first off, there's two effects. There's the displacement effect that I think people are very nervous about, right? That whenever you're implementing technology into sort of a workplace, it's going to be labor saving. But there's also what economists are increasingly wanting to talk about are called productivity effects, right, of automation. And the idea here is that the new technology comes in, a new set of jobs are created, tasks are created, and raises labor productivity, and then these people's compensation is higher. They're able to then spend more of this money in the community, which expands opportunity in other like retail services, et cetera. And then you also, as you said, there's this transitional piece you have to provide. Right? You need to have the new types of that workforce that will fulfill those skills. And then as we move forward, those are the considerations that have to be taken. The good news is, it's my work and the work of others. It does seem to find that that the people who are at risk, the greatest at risk of losing jobs due to automation, are your younger, less educated, less skilled minority workers. That's the stuff that Richard Freeman and I found, and we're continuing to work on that. And so and so from a standpoint of retraining, reskilling, but also improving educational opportunities as these people are growing up, becomes very, very important. The good news, as Robert said, and others have said, I mean, that transportation typically on average, right, do offer higher paying jobs. So that's a good news. But the one concern I do have, though, around that higher paying and jobs is, as I said, David Weil has been doing this work on fissured workplaces, and he used to be one of the administrators at the Department of Labor for Wage and Hour. And, one of his concerns is, and some of these transportation companies I think he's documented that they're doing this, and that is, many of their workers or employees who used to be W-2 employees are now 1099 workers, right? Or that they're hired by some third party intermediary who is their primary employer. What does that do to the large transportation logistics company? Well, it frees them of this labor cost. And Weil and others have shown, right, that potentially wages are lower, also other kinds of benefits and supports that workers and their families need also are lower, and then there's been connected to working conditions. So not all employers are doing this, but it's enough. It's large enough to where David has been seeing it in the data, and I have a student that we're working on this project. So. So those are just some warning signals that things that I'm watching and I'm concerned about.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and I think we're definitely seeing that with the Postal Service, right? They contract out a lot of their weekend and whatever. And I was originally going to bump to Aisha, but since you kind of segued nicely to that, I'm going to bump to Chris first on this, and not to put UPS on the spot about contract workers, but you know.
And before let me say, I mean, I have totally understand why certain business practices are taken, and contract working may make sense. I mean, in academia, we have a lot of contract workers, but the bigger point for me is ensuring that these individuals are in a safe and fair workplace, and that their work and their productivity is being honored.
Thanks, Bill. Chris?
No, thanks, Bill. And then to that point, thanks, Courtney. As you know, I mean, UPS is actually one of the largest Teamsters. Our employees are employees. They're not contractors, as much of our competitors are in the arena. And then I will talk about, though, automation. We embrace automation. It's needed. You have to do that. But as we've been automating at UPS, we've also gone from 400,000 employees to 500,000 employees worldwide. So automation hasn't stopped us from growing and hiring. This past holiday season, we needed to hire over 100,000 additional employees. 30% of those employees will be offered jobs at UPS to stay and start as a career. Myself, I started as a peak hire as a driver for UPS, and here I am 28 years later. So, these opportunities are there. And automation, I go back to, before there was email and we had to fax over things and everything. Our business hasn't changed any. We deliver more packages than ever, even though, everyone was afraid that when the fax machine came out, that would, kill the overnight business. And, here we are, So these are things so automation is key. But I will say with the workforce and, kind of going back is, we're very dependent on being able to have a reliable transit system available for our employees. And one challenge where we even go above and beyond is we hire dedicated bus lines to go to certain urban areas to give people the opportunity to have transportation to and from work. And I'm not talking a 10 or 15 minute drive. We're talking 45 minutes to an hour bus rides round trip to go and make sure, we're giving people the opportunity who are applying, who want to work and come and work at UPS. And it really kind of opens up the door for them. And hopefully they'll turn out and make a career of it. So the opportunity is there. But automation, it has to be embraced. We look at autonomous, we look at drones. You can't ignore those. Those are keys to being successful in business and continue to move. But we're also very, proud that, we continue to grow our workforce year over year. And I will say, and we talked about this offline, was, for example, there's a shortage of tractor trailer drivers in the country. And that's a great, well-paying job of people. And we're not the only ones, everybody's struggling in that industry to hire people to be tractor trailer drivers who, it's a six-figure job. And yet there's just not the talent pools out there that wants to get involved in that. And that stands for so many types of jobs, whether it's mechanics, maintenance employees. I always, when I talk to people and I go to school, sometimes I talk to kids at career day, and they, everyone's familiar with getting a UPS package delivered to their home. But I said, do you think there's a medical person that works at UPS? And, people shake their heads. Do you think there's accountants, engineers, builders, pilots, and everything? And they, kind of light bulb goes off like, oh, I didn't realize in transportation, all those type of career opportunities exist outside of just, seeing somebody who's driving a truck and delivering a package or something like that. And that's kind of the point we always want to drive home with people as we try to not look at UPS as a short-term or transportation as any career, company, but look at it as a long-term opportunity. And then, are we providing them that opportunity? And that's where, we really rely on the transportation networks for the urban areas, for some of our larger facilities. Courtney, you mentioned, the Hamilton, Trenton area. We have a large facility in Secaucus, we call the Meadowlands, that hire, employees well over 1,000 employees. I think it's more like about 1,600 employees. So that's a lot of that's part-time, and they need a very dependable network. And so we worked very closely with the New Jersey Mass Transit and everything during the height of the pandemic, when schedules were being scaled back, to make sure everybody still had that opportunity to be able to come to work And then when not, we would add, we were adding additional buses at our own expense to afford everybody the opportunity to move back and forth to get to work.
Chris. Aisha,
So
chime in here.
I think your sequencing actually worked out after all. Between Bill and Chris, they hit on many of the points that I was going to touch on. I guess I would just add, in addition to reskilling and training really being critically important, I think the matching piece, Chris touched on the shortage of talent, that matching piece. And having that commitment and engagement upfront from employers. So on the training provider end, it's not, just training for training's sake. I previously led the Newark Alliance, which oversaw the city's largest workforce development effort called Newark 2020, and had a pretty aggressive goal to place 2020 Newark residents into any of the corporate and anchor institutional partners by the year 2020. So we actually met that. It was a pledge that was made in 2017. We reached that goal actually almost a full year early because we regularly and actively engaging the employers. So by not just identifying and matching, but really working to train folks through our career pathways efforts, we literally had employers plucking people out of the training. Probably not the best thing, right? Especially when they're going through a credentialed training. But when people are unemployed or underemployed, they're obviously jumping at those opportunities. And that one program, training program was diesel technician. So to Chris's comments of really thinking about how holistic and the range of workforce opportunities that become available, I think that one just really resonates. And then just one other quick thought, in addition to like thinking about sourcing and training talent, I do think that we also need to be thinking about investing in infrastructure and innovation to attract and grow and invest in the tech side of the industry, right? So even as it relates to Newark, that could be around logistics technology, right? So we have true net job growth. And I think just making sure that we continue to talk about these hand in hand, these issues hand in hand. So it's not jobs or innovation, but that we're really beginning to truly match up the growth of specific sectors and industries that are producing the types of jobs that we should be training towards, right? So hope that connection is making sense, because in many respects, on the workforce trainer side, sometimes we think of it more reactionary. Okay, now this is available, so let's train for what is needed, i.e. shortage of talent. But I think we can also just be more deliberate about integrating the business attraction and industry growth side with workforce.
Great, thank you. And kind of, I guess what I'm hearing here is collaboration is needed. And it's really a public-private partnership. And whether it's the public leading or the private leading, neither one of them are going to get it done on their own. And they really need to be working together when it comes to workforce related to transportation. Robert, you have anything to add to this topic?
I hope you stole I was going to say
sorry.
same thing, that no, the partnerships are really what's needed, intermediaries to connect people, while transportation is in its box, right? Until we can branch that out and connect to other intermediaries, community colleges and things like that. We just don't do a really good job at that all across this country. We really need to. And we don't have New Jersey specific data alone, but in the New York Metro and the Philly area together, it's about 10% of jobs that are in infrastructure, as I said in the presentation. And the top three, most of those are light delivery drivers, heavy delivery drivers. So we talked about trucking already with Chris. But then the third is bus drivers, both public and private. And so there is an awful lot of jobs that are in that space. Huge shortages in that as well, as Chris mentioned. Same thing on the trucking side. You've got metropolitan areas. I don't think it's the case in New Jersey, but other parts of the country where they don't have buses are not going out for their routes because they don't have the drivers to take them out, right? So there's a lot of jobs there that need to be filled, and agencies are having a very difficult time connecting to people who are looking for employment for lots of different reasons. So that's certainly a source. And if there is going to be an infrastructure investment, and if transit agencies are going to have the ability to do this, they can replicate what's happening in places like Los Angeles and Chicago, Washington, D.C., where they've created infrastructure schools that are catching kids right when they're coming out of high school and getting them directly employed into some of these transportation jobs, building, driving, operating, all that kind of stuff. So Los Angeles is probably the best case right now. They're building literally a brick and mortar school to start training kids for a lot of the jobs that are existing in that area. It's something that can be scaled and replicated across the country.
It's amazing. Anyone have anything more on this particular topic? So this wasn't on our list of questions, so I'm going to dump it on you because we've got about 5 minutes before we actually have to go to Q&A. So I'm thinking if everybody could just give, a minute, where do we go from here? What does the state of New Jersey, Northern New Jersey, need to do to kind of maximize its opportunity from transportation? Why don't I bump it as keynote, bump it back to you, Robert, but keep it to about a minute if you can. So
When I was hoping you'd maybe go last that time.
Sorry.
I think it is about recognizing the state's strengths. I mean, what the state does best, kind of where the opportunities are, and as I said, nest transportation under that. It's, the state is a leader we talked about trade and logistics and things. We know the proximity to two major metropolitan areas, leader in climate. The transportation conversation then should be nested under those other priorities. The needs and the opportunities in New Jersey are just not the same as they are in other parts of the country. It has to recognize what it does best and nest the conversation under that.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Bill?
Sure. So I would use the 3 R's that were utilized to help think about policy response during the Great Depression, and that's relief, recovery, and reimagination. And so I think the first part of it is the relief piece is just making sure that transit workers have safe workplaces, and then also for riders, that riders can have a safe ride, and that those will rebuild, right, confidence in the system. And I know that behaviors are being done, but they probably have to even be done at a more enhanced level. So that's the relief piece, and then the recovery piece, and particularly reimagination, gets at some of the things that Robert and others have talked about. But I think the big challenge is going to be, right, finding the dollars to make those investments, right, to get us back from the deferred maintenance that I think I've seen in the human priorities conversation, but it sounds like it's also, we've deferred a lot of maintenance and growth in transportation. And so this brings me to like some of the comments that Chris and Aisha mentioned, where they describe how their companies and other companies are, right, seeing, right, they've had the aha moment that it makes sense for our longevity and our sustainability to be involved in these communities, to be a union friendly or supportive of collective bargaining, that process, and that actually will ensure that the company and these organizations are here 50 years from now, 100 years from now, because they're investing in communities, investing in people, and really taking to heart what happened last year with the murder of George Floyd, and really understanding that a part of going forward is really having a safe and fair workplaces that are inclusive.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Chris?
I just want to say, I would say collaboration between, I like to say it's not a win-lose. I want it to be a win-win-win. And that's really through the community, the state, and then the business that's conducting in those communities. So, really having everybody kind of come together to make sure it can't be a win-all, winner takes all type of mentality. You kind of have to work together on some things. Not everything's going to fit into the areas of how you're going to do business and everything like that. So I think it's just important to really come together, have collaboration, have an open dialogue. We have a great relationship with all the states, and it's just good to be able to sit down and have a healthy conversation to talk about things and hear both sides of pros and cons and things, and kind of really, I know that the word doesn't come out often enough, whether it's a compromise, whatever you want to call it, but I really think it's a question of collaboration and being able to come together. And I think, New Jersey does have that. We, like I said, I can say we have a very good relationship with the states here in New York and New Jersey, where we have those dialogues. Not things don't always happen right away. It takes time, and that's understandable. But I think it's important to just always keep that dialogue and keeping the ball moving forward.
Thank you, Chris. And Aisha, I'm giving you the last word before the Q&A.
It's going to feel a little self-serving, but I think a more intentional integration around like an urban plan and a transportation plan. There's of course a lot of overlap, but I think having some intentionality around that integration, I think will just benefit the entire state. The second thing I would say is planning that really just puts pedestrians first. And from a corporate view, and I have to get used to saying that since I'm only 3 months in on the corporate side. If I put my corporate hat on, that is of interest for talent attraction and retention, right? To have livable, walkable, thriving streets with activity, but it also, of course, benefits small business owners and benefits the residents in the cities. And we talked a little bit earlier about corporate policy, and I think as corporations and anchor institutions, we can be a lot more proactive about measures that we can make internally, but also on the public side, I think the engagement on the corporate side can certainly be leveraged for the benefit of the cities in which we're based and the economies that we're trying to strengthen. So I guess those would be the three things that I would highlight.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you all for great conversation. Now we're going to bump it over to audience Q&A, and we're welcoming Melissa Hayes from NJTPA, who's been following the chat and is going to relay some questions.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with one because you were all just talking about this a few minutes ago about workforce development. I know we heard a lot about the truck driver shortage, but when we're looking at the future, there's a lot of talk about technology and automation. And so we had a question from an attendee about what sorts of skills training should be offered today to prepare for the workforce of the future. Bill mentioned in the chat, and I don't think attendees could see it, so I just wanted to mention it to the attendees that soft skills are still really important, computer skills, working collaboratively, and those sorts of things. But are there, future jobs that we should be preparing the workforce for? And what skills does that entail? I don't know who wants to take that one.
I mean, I'll add on to I think what I had shared. I mean, it's at one level, right? There's as I tell my students, it's rather. It actually told me this the other day. Right? There are a host of jobs that existed several years ago and don't exist today, and then there are a host of jobs that didn't exist yesterday or even the week before, but now do. And this is not a transportation example, but take contact tracing, right? I mean, those jobs did exist prior to the pandemic, but just as Chris talked about, right, the increase in demand at UPS and just more globally, right, in terms of transportation jobs, right, that contact tracing is really emerging, and then there's positions on top of the actual community contact tracer. So that's why I answer that. It still seems to be very much soft skills. It seems to be right around problem solving, communication skills, teamwork skills. Right. I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear what Robert, Aisha, and Chris are seeing or hearing specifically to transportation.
Yeah, it's actually an excellent question, and I'd love to dig deeper to see how things have changed in the new COVID environment, right? Especially just given increased reliance on e-commerce. So I right now, 2021, I don't have a strong enough sense of what the best pipeline of opportunities looks like in this new economy. But even pre-COVID, knowing the demand for skilled trades, knowing the demand, the example I gave around the diesel technician training program was pre-COVID. So I think almost looking at taking putting an overlay of COVID on top of the industries that were already in high demand, given the increase in shipping and e-commerce on the due to COVID. I don't know. I'd actually really be interested in seeing how things have shifted. But even if you just wanted to go by pre-COVID numbers, I think it's safe to say we're always referencing drivers being in high demand, technicians, and those more technical skilled trade positions.
Right. And many of those positions that you're talking about require, right, the use of computers, right, to do diagnostics. And I know it's been a number of years now, but I served on a board for a career technical school, high school in Virginia. And that was, even then, that was the sort of mantra that you were talking to students and young people, that these are very good, well-paying positions, and they're not the old mechanic, like the Fram oil filter commercial mechanic, that you actually have to have a whole array of set of skills. And then also there's the other piece that you can't discount, in that is, particularly in transportation, that being a bus driver is more than just, right, physically driving the bus. Mm-hmm. You're interacting with people in your community, right? You're interacting with customers. And so that, we can't undersell, right, the importance of those kind of interpersonal skills, because those are it's the unstated part of the job, but it's in some respect, or in many respects, it's the most important part of the task of the job. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Bill on that for sure. We at ENO, we do a lot of classes and courses all up and down the career ladder, everything from general managers down to frontline workers in the transit industry. We call them power skills instead of soft skills, because we try to make the case that these are actually really important things that you need to learn, and particularly for frontline workers. It's some of it's real basic stuff. It's resume writing. It's not public speaking, but it's talking to other folks. It's really interacting with other folks on the job, and the things Bill was getting at with customer service and working with the public. So those things are so critical, and they have been completely ignored for a number of years in the industry. And so I think a lot of general managers and transit agencies have recognized how important that is, and they're starting to bring that back and make it part of the core curriculum for the frontline workers. And as I said, there's this huge demand for places to learn from one another, and that's the stuff that they keep asking us for. How do we teach those power skills to frontline workers at these agencies?
Did anybody else want to add anything before we move on to the next question? No. Okay. Robert, we actually had a question during your presentation about that 11% of the workforce that's in infrastructure-related jobs, and I think they were just looking for you to elaborate on what types of jobs those were. Obviously, you mentioned the truck drivers. I think you talked about some of the operations, but I didn't know if you could give some examples of what comprised that 11%.
Yeah, they're drivers. I mean, that's the most that's mostly what it is. It's hard to separate out infrastructure, transportation from infrastructure, because it's the way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts all these together. It's kind of mushed. We don't really have a good definition for infrastructure either. But it's not hard to realize. As I said, it's a lot of different truck drivers, light and heavy in most metropolitan areas, and then bus drivers and other kind of drivers. These are all in the top 5 at almost every place. Different metropolitan areas have different economic makeup. So places like Louisville and Memphis, big distribution centers for FedEx and for UPS, have a disproportionately large percentage of their jobs in those areas. And there's a lot of other places where it's much smaller, because they're not logistics subs. But the key thing here is that they're not really construction jobs. I mean, some of them are electricians, and in some cases that are, telecommunications, especially in the West, there's energy jobs that are infrastructure related, but the vast majority in almost every single metropolitan area are drivers. So that has all these different implications around climate and around, especially in states where they have legalized marijuana, they have challenges getting people to take some of these jobs for lots of different reasons. But the short answer is that's mostly what we're talking about here are drivers. And as Bill was mentioning, they're generally good jobs because they pay very well, particularly at the low end of the income scale. They come with on-the-job training. They're unionized in a lot of cases. So it really is a good resource. But we've talked a lot about the challenges that we have in filling these jobs right now.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just throw a question out
Sure.
just to the group? What is y'all's sense in terms of the use or tapping of formerly incarcerated men and women, because in terms of providing potential opportunity, right, in the industry? We talked about the shortages we've been going on, particularly the truck shortages have been going on for a very long time. But I do understand, right, in terms of some of the ex-offenders are, in terms of having access, right, to get some of their rights restored on driver's licenses, et cetera. How does, what's been the response there, or has there?
I do know, Bill, in our case, we used to, on your application, we used to ask if you were ever convicted of a felon, and that, there would be a background check on that. And we since have removed that. And I want to say we probably removed that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, actually. So we didn't, not something that just, because everything's been happening lately, the optics. So yes, so that has come into play. And I don't have any statistics, though, to know if there, what success rate we've had or anything like that. But I do know that because of the pool and the opportunity and to work with everybody, that has been, is being looked at and always considered, and doesn't automatically shut the door by any means.
Yeah, I know that some public transit agencies are also being proactive and reaching out. They have programs to make sure that they're providing those opportunities for some of those individuals. Some of them are. I'm racking my brain. I don't think drivers, from what I can remember, but their positions, in bus garages, but also in offices, doing a lot of the work that they do in public transit. So it's mostly kind of a pull kind of programs that a lot of these public agencies have, because they are, they're government agencies.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Yeah.
We also had a question about last mile connections. I think, and Chris, you talked about this, but it was a little bit more than the last mile, but just getting people from where they live to their job sites. And I know, Aisha, you might be able to talk about this. I know a lot of the businesses in Newark do have shuttles to get people from the train station to their places of employment. But someone had asked about this, is it the responsibility of the transportation providers to provide more transportation? Is it the responsibility of the businesses to kick in and offer these types of shuttle services like UPS does, like some of the businesses in Newark do? They wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So maybe I'll actually answer that from both my experience at the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation as well as in Newark. So at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, 300-acre former naval base turned industrial park that has 7,000 people work there and about 400 businesses. Not the most accessible place in the world to get to, and the nearest trains are literally about a mile away. And so we used to have a pretty robust and active shuttle service that we incurred the expense for either, and then provided throughout the Navy Yard, trying to make sure that we were connecting the workers to the various employers, and looking at so in that respect, if the Navy Yard was its own little municipality, in many respects it almost acted as if it was walled off own cogeneration power plant, own security, own maintenance, all of that. We bore that burden on behalf of our tenants because we felt like it was our responsibility, and we wanted to ensure that, quite frankly, folks that didn't have cars wouldn't have the added layer of having to worry about taking trains and then getting on buses or walking and trying to figure out how to reach work on time, especially because the bulk of the workforce were really working class. In Newark, quite frankly, the shuttles have kind of been a thorn in my side since I got here. It's not the most effective traffic circulation around Penn Station. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and I know the state is starting to think about that. As is the developer of the gateway, moving carports and all of that, reducing the amount of idling and all of that. I think there's two things that really resonate when I think about the shuttles. If it was a much more pedestrian friendly experience getting from Penn Station to Broad Street, I think you would naturally see a reduction in the shuttle service. And I think the second piece of that is there is still a very high number of the workforce in Newark within the corporations and anchor institutions that are non-Newark residents. And so again, we're still catering to kind of literally shuttling people in and shuttling people out. Surprisingly, only 18% of Newarkers work in Newark, despite having some of the highest labor participation rates in the country, right? And so I think when corporations, Audible included, take on really aggressive local hiring goals, it connects to everything, right? And I think we'll see the ripple effect on things as visible as the sheer number of shuttles that are kind of lining up around the gateway in the morning.
If I could jump in, moderator's prerogative, and we do have to wrap up, but I think Aisha's points about the walkability is really important. And I think there's also an economies of scale. I think, if you have a circulator that's hitting a bunch of businesses, and I also think about this from residential too, because I live in Jersey City and we have all of these residents, each one has their own van. So each one is contributing to air congestion and traffic congestion. So if it's needed, then let's make it coordinated and not have each one have their own. But again, to the point, if you can make it walkable, then you don't even need it. So that's my 2 cents on that one. And with that, I think we are slightly after. So I'm going to hand it back to Ted to wrap us up.
Fortunate, thanks very much. And, thanks for doing a great job moderating the session. Of course, thanks to all of our speakers for a really engaging discussion, a great TPA Tuesday, really insightful, and I appreciate it. And of course, thanks to everyone who participated today. We had more than 70 people registered, which is impressive, and I want to thank you for your ongoing engagement. To that end, later this week, early into next month, we're running a whole series of virtual Plan 2050 public events. We encourage you to check them out. These include 3 deeper dive topic talks on things like transit, bike ped safety, and business, plus 3 additional general open houses where you can pretty much drop in as your busy schedule permits and talk about any transportation related issue, including stuff you might have thought about. Some of the ideas that came up today, you may want to do a little more in-depth stuff on, and we welcome that during our open houses that are coming up. So you can check out the whole schedule of everything and register for everything right on our website. Easy peasy. It's at njtpa.org/Plan 2050, and take our short survey and share it if you haven't already done so. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a super day.